Hi, my name is Daniel, and Mac and I today will be presenting on Spectre.
First off, let's talk about the history and impact of Spectre. It was independently discovered by two groups of people, actually: Paul Kosher, working alongside some others, and Jan Horn, working with Google's Project Zero. It was made public in January of 2018. However, of course, the affected hardware companies were notified in 2017 so that they could have time to actually address the vulnerability. Now, of course, as with any exploit, there were previous related exploits, and especially relevant to Spectre is the idea of side channel attacks, which we've talked about a lot in this class, and specifically cache timing. Now, work in cache timing, side channel attacks dates back to well before the early 2000s, but especially there was some work being done there that was relevant to Spectre. Now, the affected hardware was Intel, AMD, ARM, really any speculative execution CPU, and additionally, JIT compilers, such as the JavaScript JIT compiler. There were billions of vulnerable devices, and because the speculative execution implementation differs between Intel, AMD, and ARM, fixes had to be tailored for different devices. And Spectre provides access to any information in memory, and so because of that, it gets considered a high caliber exploit.
So, how does this work? We talked about this in class, so we won't spend too much time on this, but basically, it exploits a flaw in speculative execution. Uh, it calculates an offset inside speculative executed code to memory it can access by looking at the value of memory it can't access or isn't supposed to access. And then later on, it simply checks how quickly it can access its own memory or parts of its own memory to see what the offset was by looking at what's in cache right now. Uh, Obviously, there are more advanced versions of this. Fixes would either need to be incredibly difficult hardware level updates, and most hardware level updates ended up being smaller fixes that only fix some things, or patches to specific versions of vulnerabilities, which will later on cause different problems. Every microprocessor is also very different and implemented differently, which makes patching this so much more harder than it would have been if we just everyone had one CPU. The fixes also cause performance loss because speculative execution is why modern processors are as quick as they are. They don't always work. They can cause crashes. That's why one of the Windows fixes was later on reverted. And when they do work, it's typically for specific versions of speculative execution exploits, not all of them. Um, at the bottom, you can see Linus Torvald declared an Intel fix for Meltdown, quote, complete and utter garbage, to give you an idea of what these fixes look like.
Now let's talk about what's new with Spectre. Like any exploit, Spectre did not just appear and then disappear overnight. There have been many iterations of vulnerabilities that have been found over the years. You can see a few of those listed here. You can note that even a month ago, in March 2022, more Spectre vulnerabilities were being released. This is an ongoing problem that researchers are trying to deal with. And of course, different operating systems have attempted to put out solutions such as function tracing and red pulling, but nothing has been entirely successful at preserving the benefits of speculative execution while still addressing its vulnerabilities. You can see at the bottom here, this row of green boxes. This was actually from a script that tests for different speculative execution vulnerabilities on your computer, so related to Spectre. And here you can see this was run on Daniel's computer on Ubuntu 20, and there were no vulnerabilities found. Obviously, by today, a lot of the possible exploits have been denied. They've been patched out, but there are scripts available that allow you to check this.
So here are some variants of Spectre attacks and how they differ. Uh, Obviously, a big one is non-cache attacks. Most Spectre attacks focus on using the cache to look at what's been accessed. We found two big non-cache attacks in NetSpectre, where parts of the CPU powered down or up for AVX instructions, and we look at how quickly AVX instructions execute to see if an AVX instruction was executed previously. AVX is just an extended instruction set that lets you do some complicated math quicker. Another one is Smother Spectre. It uses port contention in multi-threaded processors, which basically means it looks at which parts of the processor execute different instructions, which could depend on some data, and then looks at how different other code that is being executed at the same time is affected, trying to guess from that which parts or which ports were being utilized at the same time by speculative execution. JavaScript is another big problem. It's used on every single web page, and with just-in-time compilers, it's compiled down to machine code, which means it's basically the same exploit. Now it can be remotely executed and be on any browser, which is obviously a ginormous problem. Something interesting we also found was speculative buffer overflows, where you basically use speculative execution to bypass buffer overflow protections, letting you, in the speculative execution code, basically do whatever you want, just like we did with buffer overflows, executing whatever code you want, overwriting anything, and that's a popular tool. So what's next? 4 years ago, Intel claimed that in 4 to 5 years there would be complete hardware level mitigation. Obviously, this did not happen, and in that time, we've shifted a lot to software level mitigation. One of the software level mitigation strategies is just reducing attack surface, making it more complicated, more difficult to do particular things, and making it so that if you do want to attack someone, you'll need very complicated code, and it will need to be tailored to who you're attacking. We've also started to put responsibility on software. Intel claims that software following our guidance already has protections against incidental channels when a new exploit was published a couple months ago. And one of these guidelines is constant time programming, which, as we've seen before, does work for these types of things, especially for the cache versions, but it also obviously makes it a lot slower.
Let's give a demo of how Spectre actually works. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Spectre has kind of been patched out of a lot of modern operating systems, and so we won't be able to actually represent how the exploit functions, but we put together a visual representation that will give you the essence of how the exploit works. On the left, we have Alice. Alice is just finishing homework 3, Overflow Lab. You'll notice visually she's very unhappy. It was not a fun lab. Bob on the right cannot figure out homework 3 at all, but he understands Spectre, and we can imagine that they're both working on the same machine, different profiles in the same address space. Now let's take a look at sort of a representation of what might actually exist in physical memory. Here, this is obviously a simplification. We put Bob's memory next to Alice's memory, and it is important to note that their memory being adjacent is not necessary for the exploit. We just figured that this was a much easier way to understand how exactly the data was being accessed. You can see here, Bob has nothing in memory. It's obviously because he's done no work, whereas Alice's memory actually has some data, and that's what Bob will be trying to steal. Let's take a look at what the actual code for Bob accessing Alice's memory might look like. On the left here, we have some basic pseudocode just to demonstrate the essence of the exploit. You'll notice that Bob is going through and he's based on values in Alice's memory, he's accessing different values in his own memory. Now note that, of course, in this example that we give here, he wouldn't be able to actually access values in Alice's memory. However, if this were all encapsulated in an if statement that the microprocessor assumed to be true, then he would be able to actually access values in Alice's memory and use it to access different values in his own memory. And what this allows him to do is then check how long it takes him to access values in his own memory. And using this information, he can determine, based on which of his values have been cached, what the values in Alice's memory actually are. Now note that, of course, this is a very simple example of the exploit. Obviously, iterations since then have become a lot more complicated, but this gives an idea of the actual essence of the exploit.
So what are our takeaways? Is obviously still a very relevant problem and may always be relevant. A permanent fix is unknown, and obviously the current fixes are not perfect. Fixes have trade-offs. They don't fix everything, and they make performance worse, which means a lot of people might choose to disable them, especially because they are given the explicit option. New hardware will always have more advanced speculative execution, which means more undiscovered bugs and exploits. One of the things that keeps this from being far, far worse is it does require access to a computer, which means you have to physically be able to launch a program you want to run that'll check the cache. Defensive capabilities lag behind offensive, as with all software, but this is a particularly competitive industry. CPUs and new developments are always being made. New exploits always appear. It also leaves no traces because of just how it works. There's no way to know that it happened unless you specifically always check what every single speculative execution you do does and what memory it accessed. But normal things also do the same, so it's almost completely undetectable.